studying American and English literature, but I was very lonely and bored while I was writing my dissertation, so I started using chat rooms, which were very new in 1995. At that time, it was mostly engineers, academics, librarians, some artists, and there are very few women in chat rooms in 1995, maybe less than 10%, yet 50% of the people I met in chat rooms said they were women. So I was very interested in this question of people changing their identity and representing themselves as having a different gender. In 1995, transgender was not an identity exactly, and it was still a very homophobic society. But I met a man who, I met an Asian woman who wanted, and I thought, I'm an Asian woman, I'll talk to this Asian woman. She said she was a geisha and talked about sex a lot. And I talked to this Asian woman and I realized it was actually a white man. So I was very interested from looking at masquerade and passing and gender switching and literature to seeing how people were doing this in everyday life. So I wondered, why did he want to do this? What was he getting out of it? He was curious about Asian culture, but I think he wanted to live a different fantasy of an alternate sexuality and relationship to people who were far away. So it was a cosmopolitan community. I could see people engaging in writing practices that were new practices, using new pronouns for themselves. In 1995, people had pronouns like ze, which are now coming back from a different perspective, from people who are absolutely rejecting of male or female categories. So I decided that literature was not an evolving field in the same way as this was, but that many of the techniques of studying literature, which were to look at language carefully, to see what traditions people were speaking in. So this man had read a lot of literature about Japan, and he was actually using that to create his own identity, to represent a realness or authenticity about being an Asian woman. And I've been studying that ever since. So in '95, there was barely the World Wide Web. Chat rooms were somewhat popular. The internet was hard to use, very expensive. And now it's been 22 years since that time, and people are using mobile more for computing. It's interesting to me that young people don't think of mobile as computing, but it is. It's exactly everything miniature and kind of wireless and easier to use. So as a teacher at the University of Michigan, I've been teaching digital studies for 20 years only, and the classes are getting bigger all the time. Because I think humanities students realize this is where art, literature, movement, engagement with the public is all happening, and they want to work in those fields, but they realize those fields have history and they have often controversies around them about gender, particularly about race. So I started playing Xbox Live games and listening to what people were saying in the games and realizing there is incredible hatred of women that people when no one can see each other, you often see like terrible threats against women and incredibly sexist talk. So I was interested in understanding, not condemning it, but understanding it. You know, where does the desire come from? Where do these insults come from? How does that practice of communicating create opportunities for either being a different gender or criticizing a different gender? Yeah, I've decided to focus my research in two areas, both of which are very big because the internet's gotten very large, and video game culture is one of them. Both video games as texts that signify identity. I teach a game called Journey, which I think is a beautiful, it's a Sony PS4 game, where players are cooperative and no one has a gender. It's very interesting how they created an avatar that has no gender, A lot of people cry at the end because they connect with other players who help them. It's a game where you can only help people. And I study social media. So those are the two aspects. And that used to be a smaller thing, and now it's gotten very big. So I study Twitter. I've written about, I've not written about Instagram. It's a little hard for me because as an older person to understand it. Snapchat I do not understand, particularly World of Warcraft I played for 10 years. So I can write about specific, communities and games very, very well. So I study race and gender, and now interested in material culture of the internet. So when we use our cell phone, we take for granted that somebody created this object for us. I think my students think that cell phones are made by robots, but they're made by women exclusively. If you have a cell phone or a computer, it was made by a woman in China. Almost certainly I can tell you a woman in China. In a big factory with maybe 1 million people in it. So how do we understand that practice of gendering the making of electronics? Why is it only women who tend to do that work? Why is it in Asia? And how is it that we forget the platform when we're using it? So for Twitter, it's 140 characters. Somebody decided that. There's no way to change it. There's now kind of workarounds to making Twitter long form, so you can do 1 of 5, 1 of 6. And people who study literature understand that serial writing is a tradition. It's not anything new, but people are learning how to employ serial writing to do long things with short forms. So I'm very interested in that as well. So we need to understand it, right? I think that the danger is privacy, actually. I'm very concerned about young people having information about themselves, about their sexuality, which could endanger them if somebody is able to access it. The inability to erase material is very concerning to me. I'm very mistrustful of industries that say they have anonymous data, but I'm not sure that it's anonymous. So I feel like we are continually pouring valuable data of our own into every platform that we use, and have not really stopped to think about how valuable that is to our own development, but also to protect ourselves. So I don't study the technical part of the internet as much, but I'm very interested in things like Tor or Signal, which try to protect users. I use a VPN myself at home. And I'm not even sure that's enough at all. But, in some ways you have to go back to the 90s when we did our own kind of, you had to do some programming, you had to do some actual line command work to use the internet. In some ways now I think we're going back to that to be proficient and to protect yourself, you have to understand more about computing. So I feel like humanists know how to use libraries and archives, but knowing how to use digital archives is just as important, I feel. So I think a revolution is coming where users are going to want to claim back their own personal data. And whether governments are going to help that or whether there's going to be a social movement to enable that, I think that that's inevitable. That's my feeling about it. Yeah, I've been teaching courses on video games mostly for the last 10 years because students are so passionate. They really are happy to take a course. They've been studying video games most of their lives and have never had a conversation about it. So how do images affect women when they play video games and they see violence against women? Or how does it affect our understanding of history when we see the Cold War reenacted and you get to kill somebody who looks like you or who looks like your enemy or something? So I feel like it's required to teach students about this, not just about safety, but the basics of how the internet works. You know, who has the image? You know, is it on a server? Who owns the server? How is the company financed? What's its incentive to provide privacy for people? Women often are shamed by having naked pictures. I feel like it hurts them more than it hurts men. So I think one of two things will happen. Either everybody will have a naked picture and no one will care. And so you'll be prime minister, everybody's naked picture will be out there, so it will be absolutely normal. Or there will be continued shaming of people who are vulnerable people because they did not receive the education, right? So I think if we want people to understand how the means by which they construct their own self, so the technical means, but also the material means, you know, how the platform, the device affects what you can do. I have students who bring in the reading for the class on their phone. So they read the articles on a small screen. What? Oh my gosh, okay. So that's a very different experience of understanding theory if you're reading theoretical work. In some ways it's beautiful because you have to, you know, someone like Nietzsche wrote in such short paragraphs, such short chapters, you're creating a kind of aphoristic experience for yourself where everything is kind of pithy and short. So something like Twitter, I think Nietzsche was doing like a Twitter kind of project because everything is very pithy and concise, right? So I think that we compete for our students' attention because they're reading in this way, but I also think we need to study that kind of reading. You know, what if all books were this big? What would that have meant in the medieval time or the Renaissance or, you know, in the Victorian time? When I go to secondhand shops, sometimes I see books that are this big, but they're always Bibles. They're always sacred texts. So what does that mean? We're now reading everything as if it were a sacred text that we could carry around. Do you feel it changes your reading? There's a new digital literacy that's emerging around these things. Everything's in the cloud. I mean, all of my writing is in the cloud. It's stupid not to write and back it up in that way. So devices are now kind of disposable. Like if I lost it, I could probably replace most of the things in there. But on the other hand, the cloud is a commodified and uncontrollable place. I have a colleague who's written a book called The Cloud, and it's about mostly social media, but also infrastructure generally, and how you think the cloud is formless and shapeless and ethereal, but it's actually wires and electricity and big buildings and big waterfalls to cool things. So you lose a lot of control when you give all your data to somebody else, because the value they get from it is for advertising mostly. So Google is an advertising company. People forget that. Facebook's an advertising company. So these have replaced television and radio as advertising media. So in some countries, television was not financed by advertising. It was financed by the government. But now this has all become privatized, you know? So I think there's a lot of concern, especially because these industries rarely employ women as programmers. So women often find it hostile. I'm going to talk about this as well. And there's a company called Uber. So you might have Uber in this country. And the labor practices are really difficult. People get paid not as much. But also, they had a scandal because Arianna Huffington was on their board of directors, and she was the only woman. And she said, if we have another woman on this, or she said, if we have one woman, me, on the board of directors, it will help the company because we'll get more women. And there was another member who said, what will happen is that we'll have more talking because women talk too much. And then he had to resign. So Uber's had a lot of problems with sexism, disregard for women, disrespect for women, and it's really hurt them as a company. There's a lot of people who are not using Uber now because the man who runs it is a horrible, horrible sexist. And he's trying to look better. I don't know if he's trying to be better, but it's actually harming perception of the company. So he needs to employ some women's studies trained workers. That's where women's studies is valuable, I think, to deal with unconscious bias, because he doesn't think he's sexist, you know, or he doesn't care because the culture is that way. So I think that students need to study this because they want to work in those industries. These are the industries that are growing. So understanding the culture that's there is really important, I think. So, you know, this is all, we forget, this is all writing. You know, this is happening through writing. A lot of face-to-face conversation is video like we're doing now, but what people are doing all day is writing, you know, with their thumbs. So how does literature help us understand writing practices? I think people write more than they ever have. You know, writing for the public, writing for their friend, writing for themselves. It's a continual writing. And that's not been talked about very much, right? You're continually producing your identity for many different audiences. If you added up all the writing you did in a month, it would be several novels. So there's only one group of people in the academia who look at that, and that's people in rhetoric and literature. So I think we can use those skills more effectively if we look at the digital. It is the real world. You know, I think, so have you played Pokemon Go? Oh, are you playing Pokemon Go? I'm the last person playing Pokemon Go. It was a trend. So it lasted for a year. It's very popular. And people were excited about it because it was an augmented reality. So you could see your everyday world, and superimposed on this is a little monster, and you have to throw a ball and catch him. And you could see him in your office, you could see him in the park, and people thought this was so great that video games are now in the real world, that it's not separate from the real world. But it's always been augmented reality. It's always been. It's just that with Pokemon Go, you have a little monster to negotiate with. So, you know, Facebook bought a company called Oculus Rift, which is a virtual reality company. And the original application was for video games, but I think the final application for them is going to be social life. That's their brand, and that's the market. I mean, Facebook is not really a gaming company. So when that happens, I think it will be. You know, you'll be with friends and people and environments in real time. So I think people were worried that the real world was losing something when people were engaged in their phones or in their laptops. But, you know, we do education online now. We do a lot of socializing online, create art online. So I don't see major distinctions. I mean, the distinction to me has to do with access. People who have expensive phones, who have Wi-Fi, electricity, those are the people who aren't living in the real world in some ways, right? They're lost in the kind of archaic past. So instead of the real world being destroyed by the internet, I think it's enhanced. It's people who don't have it, who feel like they're in an unreal world.